I had been at listening station Aegir 7 for 23 years, when Specialist Verum told me what she had found. That much is on the duty log. Most of the rest of it is in the secured archive now. And what I will tell here, I will tell because no one else at the station seems inclined to, and the men I served with are old enough that the telling will not embarrass any of us. Figure 7 sat above the rim of the Marin Reach in a slow Trojan orbit around a dim brown star nobody bothered to name. We had 4 big antenna ears and 1 small one, 8 watchstanders, 2 engineers, a kitchen that smelled of fish oil paste no matter what we cooked in it, a chaplain who doubled as the records clerk, and a freight elevator that did not work in winter. The mission was simple to state and tedious to do. We listened, we sorted, we cataloged. We made sense of what we caught when we could, and what we could not, we filed into pools that no one was paid to revisit. The galaxy is louder than people imagine, and most of what it has to say is not addressed to us. For my whole tour at Aegir 7, one of the things we caught on a quiet subband the listening branch had stamped, Trinity Far Liturgical Anomalous, was a slow 4-voice song. It came in roughly every 14 days. The carrier was weak, broadband, undirected, the sort of broadcast you make when you are not aiming at a person, only at the sky. It originated from a system named Henham Vel on the maps the locals kept of themselves, or from designation 14-7 on the Compact's old charts, which we had inherited from an empire that had owned the sector before that empire fell apart. By my 5th year, I could hum the contour of its opening line. By my 15th, I could tell you which of the 4 voices had gone silent, for which petitions, and which new voice had taken which part, and what that meant about the age of the singers if you cared to do the arithmetic. We filed it as liturgy. That is the part it took us a long time to be ashamed of. It was Verum who put it together and not me, and she had been at Aegir 7 for less than 4 years when she did. I have told that to anyone who asks about the case, and I would like to say it here, where the telling cannot be edited. She came down to my office in the middle of a winter watch, by which I mean the long part of the station's year when the brown dwarf was on the other side of us, and the cabling on the outer hull groaned all night, and put a paper printout on my desk. She was not a printout sort of person. She had laid 2 waveform sheets side by side and circled the silences between the syllables in pencil, the silences. Not the notes. Chief, she said, the gaps aren't even. I looked at it. They're never the same length twice, she said. But they aren't random either. They're carrying. I had been a comms officer for the entire third of my life. I knew what she meant before she finished saying it. The notes of the lament were ritual. The silences were not. The silences had structure. I asked her to wait. I went down 2 corridors to the cold archive and got the Compact's old emergency protocol stack out of a locked drawer, where we kept it because we kept everything. Most of it was useless. The Sovereign Compact had been gone for 2.5 centuries when I was born. What they had used for distress had no current legal force anywhere. But a protocol is a protocol, and an encryption template is a thing you can read if it is laid out in front of you. I took the printout and the protocol stack to the watchroom, where the heat actually worked, and we sat for an hour and unfolded one against the other. By the end of it, I had stopped sketching. I was only watching her hand. The silences in the lament were a sovereign distress code, not a signature, not a callback, distress, active distress, position fix, a population estimate, a request for relief, and a counter that incremented each repetition. The counter on the broadcast she had brought me read 9,418. I did the division in my head before I did it on paper. 10 days a cycle, roughly 26 cycles a sovereign year, 264 years and change. I closed the protocol stack. Specialist, I said, go and wake the watch officer. I'll be along. Chief, she said, they have been doing it the whole time. The whole time. I know what they've been doing, I said. Go and wake Lieutenant Coltsfoot. Tell him I said it isn't liturgy, she went. I sat in the watch room for another minute or 2 before I followed her up. There was no part of the procedure that needed me to sit. I sat because I had been listening to that song for 23 years, and I had been wrong about it for 23 years. And a man my age does not get the chance to be that wrong very often. And I wanted to take 1 minute to know it before I started undoing it. Then I followed her up. Coltsfoot was a thin, pale lieutenant who had been at the station for 14 months and had not yet stopped being surprised by anything. When Varum walked him through it, he asked the questions I would have asked. Had the counter ever rolled? Had the broadcast ever changed in any way we had not catalogued? Was there any chance the protocol template was a forgery, layered over a genuine cultural broadcast? Varum answered all three. Yes, the counter had rolled once at 10,000, twice at 5,000. No, broadcast had not changed in any way we had not catalogued, except that one voice was older now than it had been when we first picked it up. No, a forgery was not impossible, but a sovereign distress protocol from the compact's late period would not be worth forging by anyone alive, because no living party in the Marin Reach had any interest in pretending to be the compact. Coltsfoot looked at me. "Chief," he said, "this is your call." "It isn't, Lieutenant," I said. "It's the commander's call. I'll bring it to him. But I'd like to bring it to him with a recommendation. And the recommendation is that we treat it as active." He nodded. He had wanted me to say that, and we both knew it. "You worked late," he said. "Go bunk, I'll write it up." I did not go to bunk. Went back to the watch room and pulled the last 40 cycles of the broadcast and laid them out next to one another on the long table where we usually did weather plots. I wanted to see whether the position fix had drifted. It had not. The senders, whoever they were, had not moved. They were on the same world, in the same coastal hemisphere, at the same elevation, broadcasting at the same time of day local. They had not given up on the address, even after the Empire. At the other end of it had been gone for 10 generations. I do not have a religious bone in my body. I will tell you that plainly. I went to my bunk that morning and lay on my back and stared at the cold pipework along the ceiling for an hour. And I thought about people I had known, who were now dead, and about what it would have cost them to keep singing at the dead, and whether any of them would have, and whether any of us would. I did not come to a conclusion. I went to sleep. When I woke up, the recommendation was on Commander Tarse's desk, and the question had stopped being whether we believed it and started being what we were going to do about it. Commander Hale Tarsus was 61 years old and had not been to a planet's surface in a decade. He had been a destroyer captain in his younger life and had taken Aegir 7 because he liked quiet work and because his daughter ran a vineyard on the south face of a hill in the wine country, and he wanted to live long enough to taste a vintage of hers without the medical division taking his ration. He was not a sentimental man. He was a methodical one. He read the recommendation. Then he read the protocol stack. Then he asked Varum to walk him through the syllabic decode. Then he asked me one question. "Holm," he said, "how long is it going to take us to argue about this? And how long does the broadcast suggest they have?" "I do not know what they have, sir," I said. "The population estimate has been dropping in the protocol field, slowly, linearly. The last cycle was lower than the cycle before by 0.5%. How long has it been dropping at that rate?" "About 40 years. He sat with that for a moment. "Holm," he said, "I do not want to argue about this for 40 years. No, sir." "Listening command will want to argue." "Yes, sir. Get me an asset map of the hollow rim and the systems bordering it. Anything Earth has within 50 days transit. I want the closest cruiser. I want the closest tender. I want a hospital frigate that I do not have to steal. Sir, and Holm, while you are at it, I would like the cleanest version we have of the broadcast. If we are going to send this to listening command, I want them to hear the song." I had the asset map on his desk inside 2 hours. I had the cleanest cut of the broadcast in his audio queue inside 3. He listened to it once. He did not listen to it twice. He had been a destroyer captain, and he did not need to hear the same thing twice to decide what to do. He sent the package command at the second watch change, with the recommendation attached, and with a note in plain procedural language that read, "This signal has been broadcast continuously for 264 years. The senders have not stopped singing. We have stopped listening. I propose we resume. I will say here because it has bothered me since." Listening command did not argue, not for 40 years, not for 4. They argued for 19 hours. At the end of the 19 hours, they sent back a one-line answer, which I have not been authorized to quote, but the meaning of which was, "Go." The closest Earth warship to the hollow rim was the patrol cruiser Erland, on a long arc through the lower edge of the Reach, With 8 days to her next scheduled port, she turned. The closest engineering tender was the Barrow, on the return leg of a depot run with a full load of biosphere stabilization equipment she had been bringing home for refit. She kept the load and turned. The closest hospital frigate was the Hesper, which had been on station above a colony world running routine vaccinations. She finished the vaccinations on a compressed schedule, on a doubled medical complement, and turned. 3 ships, a patrol cruiser, an engineering tender, a hospital frigate. The roster called the convoy Forward Relief Element 9. We called it the Three. The Three were under the command of Commodore Anouk Draver, flagged out of the Erland, and whom I had met once at a ceremony where neither of us had felt entirely needed. She was a thin, deliberate woman with a face the cold weather had not been kind to, and a habit of asking the question after the question. Standing order for the transit was simple. She wanted every cycle of the broadcast we could give her, by relay in real time, translation of the protocol fields. She wanted to know what the counter said when she arrived. She did not want to have to be told. We sent her everything. I sat at the watch desk myself and packaged the cycles as they came in and pushed them along the relay chain toward the Three. Veyram did the protocol decode and tagged the population estimate, the position fix, and any change to either. There were no changes. The senders were still where they had always been. They had not yet noticed that anything was different. We also pulled, on the Commodore's standing request, every cycle we had on file, from the 23 years of my tour and the 37 years of tours that had been before mine. The cold archive ran 4 floors below the watchroom and was kept at a temperature that obliged a man to wear a coat to work in it. Veyram and I worked the archive in shifts. We had not, I am embarrassed to say, ever pulled the full file before. We had pulled cycles in clusters. Last year's, the year of the counter rolling over, the year a new voice had joined the fore. But we had never sat down and put every cycle end to end on a single time axis. We did so on the 7th day of the transit. It ran for 20 hours of playback, at the rate the watch desk could process it. 20 hours is a long time to sit in a room. I was not in the room the whole time. Veyram was. She brought a thermos, and a paperback, and a small lamp, because the overhead in the cold archive was uneven, and she sat at the long table and listened, and at intervals she came up to the watchroom and told me the number of the cycle she had reached and any small thing she had noticed. On the 2nd hour she told me that the voice carrying the first part for the last 41 years had taken over, a voice that had carried the same part for 36 years before that, and that the handover had been clean, no overlap, no rehearsal cycles, no doubled performances. Whoever the older voice had been, he had stopped singing on a fortnightly broadcast, and the new voice had begun singing on the next one. And the silences between the syllables, which were what carried the distress code, had not changed by so much as a stutter. The protocol field for the population estimate had ticked down by 1 human equivalent on the handover cycle, and not on any cycle near it. On the 11th hour she told me that there was a cycle, dated to the early winter of my 14th year on station, which had been recorded with 3 voices instead of the usual 4. The 4th voice had been silent for that cycle, and the cycle after, and had returned, at full timbre and full posture, on the 3rd cycle, and had carried its part for 9 years after that, until being replaced in turn by another. She had cross-referenced the cycle date against the station's incoming traffic log, which we kept for compliance reasons, and which I had not looked at in 11 years. She told me what I had been listening to on the watch desk on the day of the 3-voice broadcast. It was a piece of routine survey work from a freighter that had reported a hold fire and had not in the end lost the hold. I remembered the freighter. I did not remember the broadcast. I remembered the freighter because it had been my first watch as a senior comms officer, and I had handled the fire report myself. I had no way to know what had happened. In the late autumn of the Henner calendar, that had taken the 4th voice out for 2 cycles. A man had died, probably, or a woman, or a man's voice had given out the way an older voice can, and another singer had been brought in late, and a cycle had been done short rather than missed entirely. Athar Vel, when he was asked about it months later, did not know. The choir of the last watch had not kept that kind of record. The compact had not kept that kind of record. We had not kept it either. We had been listening to a freighter's hold fire. I said to Veyram, when she came up at the 14th hour, that I would like, when we had finished pushing the file to the 3, to sit with her for an evening and write down every cycle we could identify a handover or a gap in, and date each handover it on a single chart. I told her I did not know what the chart would be for. She told me she did not either, but she would do it. That was the part I had not ready for in a dream, and it caught me 4 nights into the transit when I had been awake too long. The senders had not yet noticed. The senders did not know that anything had changed. They were still broadcasting into the same emptiness they had broadcast into for 10 generations, because the broadcast was so old that there was no one alive in any of the systems within 10 light years of them who could have told them their distress had finally been heard. The light from Earth's reply was still on its way to them. Cycle by cycle they were still asking, would not know, until the 3 arrived in the system that anybody, anywhere had ever picked up the phone. I went out the airlock anteroom that night and stood with my hand on the cold pane of the outer port and looked at the dark and did the thing that, in my profession, you are not supposed to do. I let myself feel the size of it. 264 years, 11 generations of priests, 9,421 repetitions by the time the 3 made transit. Every 14 days, someone with a particular kind of voice had stood at a particular kind of console and sung 4 notes and a silence and 4 notes and a silence into a sky that the rest of us had not been listening to, and they had been doing it for longer than my country had been a country. And they had been doing it on the assumption that someone was supposed to answer, and nobody had. And the answer that was coming was not the one they had asked for. I went back to the watch desk and packaged the next cycle. There is a thing you do in the listening trade, which is that when you start to feel the weight of what you have heard, you stop feeling it, deliberately, and you go back to the procedure. You do this for 2 reasons. The first is that the procedure is what got it heard in the first place, and what is going to get it answered, and feeling is not. The second is that if you do not stop feeling, you will not be able to keep listening, and there is always more to listen to. I went back to the procedure, so did Veyram, so did Coltsfoot, so did Tarsus. We packaged cycles, decoded fields, fed them down the relay, drank bad coffee, ate worse soup, and waited for the 3 to arrive. They made the hollow rim in 51 days. The Erland led, the Barrow followed in the slot. The Hesper trailed on the outside in case anything came up that wanted to shoot at her. Nothing did. The hollow rim was empty. The Sovereign Compact had been the hollow rim's reason for being. With the compact gone, rim had nothing in it but the broadcasters and the silence around them. There was no traffic. There was no defense net. There were no other listening posts. The 3 came down the corridor unchallenged and unobserved by anything that would have been counted by anyone in living memory. Henham Vell, the home that remained in the locals' tongue, was a small, ash-blue world with a thin coastal belt around one continent and a great rust-colored interior that nothing lived in anymore. 3 put down in atmospheric orbit and hailed the surface on the Sovereign emergency channels. They got nothing back. They hailed on the Compact's old administrative channels. Nothing. They hailed on the band the broadcast went out on. It was the only band Henham Vell appeared to use at all. Nothing. Commodore Drever did the sensible thing. She had the Hesper send down a single courier sled with a translation package recorded in the Sovereign administrative tongue. Old, formal, by the book. That said, in the words I would have used myself, "We have heard your signal. We are friends of the Compact's purposes. We have come to assist. We request a meeting on the ground." The sled went down. The sled landed on the coast. The sled was met by people who did not, at first, seem to know what to do with it. I have read the after-action reports of what happened on that beach. I have watched the footage. I have sat with the Hesper's surgeon, Mira Tolan, 2 years later in a town on Earth that was not hers or mine, and I have listened to her describe it. And what she described was not the kind of meeting Animal Fam would put in the middle of a movie. There was no flag waving. There was no embrace. There was a long pause, during which everyone on both sides did the calculation of who the other side might be and could not arrive at a clean answer. And at the end of the pause, an old man in a robe the color of wet stone walked down to the surf and stopped about 10 paces short of the sled, and stood there with his hands at his sides, and said something, which Surgeon Toland's translator gave back, as, "Did you sing back?" The Marine who had been at the front of the sled's ramp, who knew her translator was working only at conversational level, and not at liturgical level, lowered the corner of her helmet and said, plainly, the words that became the line everyone on Earth's side of this would remember, because they were the only words that fit. "We heard you. We came." The old man took one step back from the surf. The Marine, having no further idea what was expected of her, repeated, "We heard you. We came." His name was Vicar-Keeper Otharvel, 11th of his line in the choir of the last watch, and he was the man who had been singing the second voice of the Lament for the past 41 years. His father had sung it before him for 36 years, his grandfather before that for 52, his great-grandfather before that for 29, and his great-great-grandfather, on whose initial recording the choir had built its working version of the broadcast, had sung it for the first 8 years after the fall of the compact, while still there was still some possibility that someone in the old empire was alive to hear it. Otharvel had inherited the Lament the way a man on Earth might inherit a small, failing farm. He had not asked for it. He had been told that the compact had had certain protectors, and that the protectors had not come when the compact had fallen, and that the compact's last working command had been to maintain the call until relief arrived. The command had not been countermanded. He had taken his shift. What I know of Otharvel, I know from the recordings, the translations, and the long meeting that was held on the second day, when Commodore Drever herself came down to the surface in a working uniform, with no rank insignia she had not strictly earned, and sat with him on a bench outside the broadcast tower in the late part of an afternoon, and listened while the Hesper's translator worked through what the choir of the last watch had thought it was doing for the past 2.5 centuries. She had brought, in the kit at her elbow, a small player. On the player was the original cut of the Lament's first repetition, the one Verum and I had pulled from the cold archive, dated by the compact's own calendar, sung by a man who had been dead longer than any of Otharvel's grandfathers had been alive. The Commodore had not played it yet. She was not sure whether to. She had decided on the way down that she would play it if and only if he asked. He asked. He asked the way a man asks who has spent his entire life on a job he does not entirely understand and has, at the end of the job, chance to learn what the job was. He asked whether we had a copy from before his line had begun. He asked whether the voice on the original cut had been a man or a woman. He asked whether the original cut had been recorded in the same chamber his choir still used. She played it. He sat. He did not cry. The Henner, as I have since learned, do not cry the way we do. He sat, and he closed his eyes, and at the end of the recording he opened them, and he said the thing I would like to put down here, in the wording the Hesper's translator gave back, because it was the cleanest version of the niche's old confession I have ever heard, and because I do not want it to be lost. "We did not sing it to you," he said. The Commodore, who had been told what to expect by Surgeon Toland, who had been told what to expect by me, by relay from the station, where I had been told what to expect by Verum, been told nothing because she had figured it all out herself, did not answer immediately. She let it sit. Then she said the line that became, for me, the answer to 23 years of liturgy on a sub-band I had not understood. "We heard it anyway," she said. "We thought it best to come." He looked at her. "You are not of the compact," he said. "No," she said, "we are not. The compact has been gone a long time. We are sorry to bring you that news. We did not know that you did not know." "We knew," he said. "We have always known. We sang because we had been told to sing. Did your people teach you to do a thing only when there was someone left to do it for?" "No," she said. "Mine did not." He turned the player over in his hands. He had the air, Toland told me later, of a man who had been carrying a sealed envelope for 40 years, and had just been told what was inside it. "How many ships did you bring?" he said. "3, she said. "We had 3 near. We would have brought more if we had had more near. We will bring more if you ask for them. Can 3 ships do?" "For what your protocol requested," she said, and here she opened a paper sheet Verum had decoded and pushed across to him. "A great deal. The protocol must bear a biasis of medic support and an administrative replacement. We have biosphere repair. We have medical support. We are not in a position to be your administrative replacement. But we can stay until you have made one of your own. He read the sheet. He did not read it carefully. He had read versions of it 1,000 times. He had sung versions of it 9,400 times. He had never seen anyone else read it before. How long can you stay, he said. As it takes, she said. I have been told by people who were on the beach that this was the part where Athervel shifted, very slightly, the position of his hands. He did not put them on the Commodore's arm. He did not raise them to his face. He moved them one at a time, from his lap to the bench beside him, and he flattened the palms against the wood, the way a man does when he has been standing for a long time, and has finally been told he may sit down. That, the Hesper's anthropologist later told me, was the Henner's equivalent of a long exhale. The three got to work. The Barrow off, loaded the biosphere, stabilization gear she had been bringing home for refit, and set it up on the South Coast platform, where the Henner's failing atmospheric processors had been limping along for 2 generations. Her engineers worked in shifts on the platform for 19 days, while a slow, steady wind off the Rust Desert tried to push them off the catwalks, and at the end of the 19 days, the South Coast Belt's processors were running at 68% of nominal compact specification, which was 40 points higher than they had been running. The day the three arrived, and the Barrow's chief engineer remarked into the after-action log that the equipment the Henner had been using to keep the belt alive was, in his opinion, the finest piece of work he had ever seen done by people who had no replacement parts, and no documentation, and no manufacturer call. I have read his report. He spent most of it describing a manifold the Henner had built out of 3 older manifolds the compact had left behind, truth, none of which had been intended to be used together, and one of which had been intended to be used in a colder atmosphere than Hennemvel's. He described it the way an old carpenter describes a piece of furniture another old carpenter made, with the eye for what could not have been easy, and with a kind of plain respect. And, without any of the bluster, a younger engineer would have brought to the same description. He concluded the report by recommending that the Barrow leave 2 of her spare manifold assemblies behind for the Henner's own engineers, along with the full set of working drawings for the original compact specification. The Commodore signed it without amendment. The manifolds and the drawings went down the same day. The Hesper sent her medical complement down to the coastal towns and worked through the rolling generational illnesses the Henner had been carrying for a century. Vitamin deficiencies the failing atmosphere had locked in, an inherited blood condition that the compact's old medical service had had a treatment for, but that the Henner had not had the precursors to produce. On their own, a slow-growing bone disease, whose cure was simple if you had the right equipment. The Hesper had the right equipment. She stayed 4 weeks. By the end of those weeks, the youngest cohort of Henner children on the South Coast, those born in the year of the three's arrival, were on track to be the first cohort in 11 generations to grow up at full sovereign standard adult height. Surgeon Tolan wrote in the after-action that she had been concerned, the first week, that the Henner would resist the precursor injections on theological grounds, since the inherited blood condition had been written into one of the choir's older lamentations as part of what was being asked for. She was wrong about the concern. The choir had been singing about the blood condition for 140 years. The choir was glad to be done singing about it. The Erland did the work that a patrol cruiser does when nothing is shooting at her, is to say she ran logistics, ran communications, and ran the courier traffic between the station and the surface, and between the surface and the Commodore did most of her work from the Erland's bridge. She came down to the surface every 4th day for a few hours, sat with Athervel on the bench outside the broadcast tower, and listened and answered and did not lecture, and did not promise more than she could deliver. She delivered everything she promised. Surgeon Tolan told me that she had never served under a flag officer who had been so plainly determined not to embarrass herself in front of a man who had been doing his shift for 41 years. I was not down there for any of it. I was at the station. We continued to receive the broadcast on the sub-band, marked Trinity Far Liturgical Anomalous, because the choir of the last watch had not yet been told to stand down, and the choir of the last watch did not stand down on the order of any party other than the one that had originally given the order to begin, and the original party had been gone for 2.5 centuries. The order to stop the lament had to come from the choir itself. It came on the 34th day after the three's arrival, after a meeting between the 7 serving voices and the line of the Vicar keeper, in which Athervel, in a recording I have heard, said the words that were translated back to me as, "We were singing into the dark because we had been told to. We will stop singing into the dark because the dark was answered." There was no further discussion. The next 14th day, I sat at the watch desk and waited for the cycle. The cycle did not come. I'd been waiting 23 years to not hear that song, and I sat at the watch desk and did not move for an hour. And Varum, who was on shift with me, did not move either, and we did not speak. And at the end of the hour, the watch officer came in and said, "It hasn't come, has it?" And I said, "No, sir, it has not." He stood there for a moment. "Log it," he said. Trinity Far liturgical traffic, source identified. Distress relieved, broadcast terminated. Cite the case number. "Sir," I said, "that is what we wrote in the log. It is in the secured archive now. I have seen it. It reads exactly as Coltsfoot dictated it, and it does not say anywhere on it that the broadcast had been received without interruption for 9,422 repetitions, and had been filed for the entirety of that time on a subband that had not been considered urgent, and that we had only stopped filing it as liturgy on the recommendation of a specialist with less than 4 years on station, and that the men at the desk, on the morning of the case closure, were both men who had been listening to the song since they were younger than the specialist was. The log is procedural. The log is correct. The log does not contain the rest of it. The rest of it is in this telling. The 3 were on station at Henham Vell for 182 days. The Barrow was the last to leave, because her chief engineer would not certify the South Coast platform until he had watched a complete atmospheric cycle through the new processors without intervention, and a complete atmospheric cycle on Henham Vell takes 90 days. It was longer than the Hesper or the Erland could justify staying. The Erland left on day 70. The Hesper left on day 112. The Barrow left on day 182. Commodore Drever was on the Erland when she lifted. She was waiting on the orbital platform when the Hesper went. She came back down on a shuttle to be there in the broadcast yard on the day the Barrow lifted, because she had said she would, and she had not, in my hearing or in anyone else's, in a single thing she had said to Athervel, from the first afternoon to the last. She did not bring him to Earth. He was offered passage. He declined. He said, in a transcript I have read, that he was 11th of his line and the line did not end with him, and the work of the last watch had changed but had not finished. And his work now was to teach the 12th of his line how to read records of a thing that had been a song until a year ago and was now a memory. He was, he said, not unhappy. He was, he said, not sure he had ever had the chance before to find out what unhappy or happy actually felt like, and he was not yet ready to know. That was the part Surgeon Tolan had a hard time telling me, in the town on Earth 2 years later. She had taken to him. She did not say so. Tell. She had a particular way of looking at the table when she spoke about him. She said, eventually, that he had asked her on the last day what we Henner, by which she meant we Earth. The translator had used the Henner word for the people who heard. What we did with the recordings of voices of people we had loved who were dead. What did you tell him? I said. I told him we kept them, she said. I told him we kept them and listened to them sometimes, and that sometimes we did not, and that there was no rule for it, and we did not always know which one we were going to do until the day we did it. What did he say? He said that was a sensible practice, she said. He said the compact had not had that practice. The compact had erased everything when a voice was lost, on the theory that the song belonged to the role and not to the person, and that, if you remembered the person, you could not properly sing the role. And then he said that the practice had cost the compact a great deal in his opinion, and that the Henner would not be following it from now on. She did not say anything for a minute after that. Holmes, she said, he asked me to send him a copy of his great-grandfather's voice, cleanest one we had. He had never heard it. They had erased it after the man died the way they were supposed to. And, I sent it, she said. I sent him the original cut Verum pulled out of your cold archive. The dated one. The one from the year after the fall of the compact. That was the right thing to do, I said. I think so, she said. I wanted to be told it was, I told her again. I told her it was the right thing to do, and that I would have done it myself if I had been the one she asked. And that anybody who had been listening to that song as long as we had would have done it, and that some things were not procedure, but were not therefore wrong. I retired from listening station Ager 7 4 years after the case was closed. The brown dwarf was on the wrong side of us when I left, and the freight elevator still did not work in winter. Verum, by then, was a senior specialist with her own watch, and a clearance high enough that she could no longer have lunch with me without paperwork. Coltsfoot had moved on to a station on the other side of the reach. Tarsus had retired the year before. His daughter had pressed a vintage of hers into a bottle in his honor, and he had drunk it, and he had said, in the only personal note I ever received from him, that it had been worth waiting for. I went home. I have a house outside a small town near the coast, with no antennas on it and no radio in any room I sleep in, by choice. I went home and I read books. My wife had been waiting for me to read for 30 years, and I learned how to bake a particular bread I had been promising her I would learn how to bake. I did not listen to the recordings of the Lament. I had carried them in my head for 23 years, and I did not need them at my elbow. The recordings are in the archive. They will be available to whoever asks for them. When the archive is opened, which I am told will be sometime after I am gone, think about Athervell more than I expected I would. I think about what it must have been like in the weeks after the three left to walk past the broadcast yard at the hour the cycle had used to begin, and to know, without any of the apparatus moving, that he was no longer needed to begin it. I think about the 12th of his line who, by the last report I have read, has begun the work of building, out of the long erased fragments of recordings that we and a handful of other archives still hold, a complete catalog of the voices of the choir of the last watch from the fall of the compact down to the present day. The Henner are calling the catalog, in their own tongue, by a word that the translator gives back as the kept. It is being built slowly. It is being built carefully. It will, when it is done, be the first thing of its kind in the Hollow Rim in 264 years. I have been asked, once or twice by men of my age, what the hardest thing was about the case. The men who ask are not the men who were on the beach with Athervell. The men who ask are men who have read the procedural account and have seen case number and have not been able to find, in the procedural account, the part that justifies the question they want to ask, which is, how could we have not heard it earlier? I do not have a good answer for them. I have a procedural one. The subband was marked liturgical because the first analyst to catalog it, 60 years before I came to Ager 7, had heard it as liturgy and had been right to hear it as liturgy because it was in fact sung. Protocol template that lived in the silences was an old compact emergency protocol that had no current legal force anywhere, and which we did not, as a matter of standing practice, run against incoming liturgical traffic. The cycle was long enough that a man might be at the station for 10 years before noticing that the song's silences were not the same length twice. The senders did not, in any cycle we have on record, alter the broadcast in any way that would have flagged it for reanalysis. We did the thing the procedure asked us to do. The procedure was not asking the right thing. That is the procedural answer. It is correct as far as it goes. The other answer, which I do not give to the men who ask, is that we filed it as liturgy because we did not believe anyone would still be singing, at the dead, 264 years after the dead had gone. We did not believe it because we would not have done it ourselves, or because we did not think anyone we knew would have done it, or because we had not yet been in a position where doing it was the only thing left to do. The Henner had been in that position the whole time. They had done it the whole time. We had not been listening for the kind of voice that does that. We had been listening for the other kinds. We have started, since the case closed, to listen for that kind too. Listening command will not say so in writing. It is in the standing orders anyway, in language careful enough that a man who knows what he is reading can find it. Verum sent me a paper card last winter. She does not send many cards. The card had a drawing of the broadcast tower on the south coast of Hennemvel, drawn from a photograph the Erland's deck officer had taken on the day the barrow lifted. There was no message on the card. On the back, in her handwriting, was a single line, which I have decided is the line I will put at the end of this telling, because it is hers, and because she earned it, and because she is the only one of us who heard the song for what it was while the rest of us were still hearing it for something else. Heard you, the card said. Came as soon as we could. That is what it said. That is what we put on the file when we closed it. It is not what is in the procedural log, which records the case in the language Coltsfoot dictated, and which I have already given here. It is what we said to one another, those of us who had been at the watch desk, in the days after the broadcast did not come. We did not say it to Othervel. We did not need to. He had been told it in the words the Marine on the beach had used, which were the right words at the right time, which I have not been able to improve on in the 12 years since. We heard you. We came. It was late. It was very late. We came anyway.